Police officers detaining a young man during a night patrol in Tecomán, Mexico. Rodrigo Cruz for the New York Times. Mexico City, the forces driving violence in Mexico, which is now on track for its worst year in decades, were first set in motion 20 years ago by two events that were, at the time, celebrated as triumphs. First, Colombia defeated its major drug cartels in the 1990s, driving the center of the drug trade from the country into Mexico. Then, in 2000, Mexico transitioned to a multi-party democracy. This meant that the drug trade moved to Mexico just as its politics and institutions were in flux, leaving them unable to address a problem they have often made worse. Since then, a series of bad breaks, missteps and self-imposed crises have led to an explosion of violence. Last year there were more than 20,000 killings. This year is on track to be worse, exceeding the 2011 record, which was thought to be the drug war's apex. Drug trafficking is not this violent in other countries, Guillermo Uvalde, a former leader of CISEN, the Civil National Security Intelligence Service, said in an interview in Mexico City. "It makes me desperate," he said, shaking his head at his country's missteps, because this violence, it's increasing. Extreme measures. Felipe Calderón, then president, sent the military to fight the drug cartels. Adriana Zebraskas for the New York Times. In 2006, a new president and a new drug cartel both took extreme actions, the consequences of which are still unfolding. The implosion of Colombian cartels set off a fierce competition in Mexico for control of the drug trade. A new cartel, La Familia Michoacana, broke off from a larger group, then cemented its power by deploying extreme, theatrical violence. Though they principally targeted other cartels, the gruesome attacks shocked Mexico. That same year, Felipe Calderón won the presidency by a hair. Though monitors approved the vote, his leftist opponent called it illegitimate, and the narrow victory for Mr. Calderón left him without a strong mandate. Shortly after taking office, the new president declared war on the cartels and sent in the military. Critics say Mr. Calderón sought to legitimize his presidency through the show of force. Defenders say he had little alternative. Mexico had been a single-party state and, like most such states, had controlled local officials through patronage and corruption. When that system disappeared, drug cartels filled the vacuum, buying off mayors and judges. Only the military had the firepower and autonomy to take them on. This began the drug war that has killed tens of thousands of people. But it also created a subtler set of problems now driving more and broader violence. Short-term solutions, long-term problems. Felipe Calderón reviewing Navy troops in 2006. Critics say he sought to legitimize his presidency through the show of force. Alfredo Estrella. Agents France Press, Getty Images. Mr. Calderón adopted the so-called Kingpin strategy, in which troops captured or killed cartel leaders. This generated headlines, pleased the United States and could be accomplished top-down, with little input from corrupt or weak local law enforcement. But this short-term solution to the drug war deepened long-term problems in bypassing mayors and governors because Mexico's pre-democratic practices had left them systemically corrupt and unaccountable. The government further reduced their accountability. And in bypassing already weak local police and judges, the government allowed those institutions to atrophy, with money and political attention diverted to military and federal forces instead. Reforms, desperately needed to fix outdated practices, 24-hour police shifts, poor evidentiary standards, a rule that forbids most police officers from conducting investigations, drifted. As the Kingpin strategy fractured the cartels, smaller groups rose in their place. Since then, said Alejandro Hope, a security analyst, there has been a significant change in the way organized crime works in Mexico. Drug trafficking required resources and infrastructure that the new groups lacked, leading many to turn to kidnapping, theft and extortion. Predatory crimes spiked. Ordinary Mexicans, once bystanders to the conflict, became its targets at a moment when the state had left them vulnerable. In the process of that fragmentation, we did the job of structuring the institutions of the police forces, said Mr. Uvalde, who ran the Civil National Security Intelligence Service as this was unfolding. So we have the worst of the worst. The key point of failure: voting in Ecatepec, Mexico. In Mexico, all candidates are selected by the party, and officials serve one term before being shuffled off to another post. Brett Gundlach for the New York Times. The solution to the problem would seem obvious. Strong police and prosecutors, overseen by politicians who are held accountable by voters, could close the vacuum in which gangs and corrupt officials flourish. Instead, disorder and violence have risen. Joy Langston, a political scientist at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics in Mexico City, traces many of the country's woes to a seemingly minor quirk in its political system. All candidates are selected by the party, and officials serve one term before being shuffled off to another post. During the one-party era, this was meant to impose accountability, which flowed from party leadership. Oversight institutions, seen as superfluous, never fully developed. Democracy, as intended, undercut the party's once all-encompassing power. But the old system built around the assumption of a strong central authority remains in place. This has weakened the state while cementing many of its old problems, creating what Ms. Langston called a nightmare scenario in which the institutions of accountability and transparency are extraordinarily weak even after 17 years of democracy. For example, voters have little opportunity to kick out bad leaders or reward good ones, giving officials little incentive to push through difficult reforms. And criminal groups are able to fill the pockets of notoriously underpaid policemen and other civil servants, often providing the wrong kind of incentives. At the end of the day, this is all an issue of accountability, Mr. Hope said. That is the key point of failure in Mexico. Nothing happens if a police officer does not do their work, he added. Nothing happens if a mayor fails to transform local law enforcement. Nothing happens if a governor fails to invest in prosecutorial services. Nothing happens. A frail state recedes, though recent electoral changes will allow some officials to stand for re-election in 2021. Deeper problems are taking root. As public outrage over corruption rises, party leaders, seeing their own careers in peril, are becoming more reluctant to risk pushing for change. I cannot think of a single prosecutor or judge who stands out on fighting corruption, said Paul F. Lagunes, a Columbia University professor who studies corruption. There are people staking their careers on this, but not in the judiciary, in the press, Mr. Lagunes said. But, he added, Mexico is one of the riskiest countries in the world to do journalism. The combination of corruption, weak accountability and weak institutions has left the state vulnerable. In poor and rural areas, it has effectively receded. Criminal groups and youth gangs are filling the void, co-opting local officials or simply muscling them out. The result may be less dramatic than Mr. Calderon's drug war, in which warring cartels publicly displayed dismembered corpses. But it is just as deadly, playing out in thousands of home invasions, gang killings and stick-ups gone wrong. State and society atomize this is leading communities to do, at the grassroots level, what Mr. Calderon did a decade earlier: bypass distrusted institutions, worsening the underlying problem. Businesses and middle-class Mexicans are hiring private security in record numbers. But like the army, hired guards cannot solve crimes or lock up suspects. Mark Ungar, a Brooklyn College professor, said this growing practice relieves a lot of political pressure on the state to improve the police. Rural communities, which are more vulnerable, have formed self-defense militias to run off gangs and mayors alike. Inevitably, the militias are even more corruptible and less accountable than the police they replaced. Nearly all target their one-time sponsors for extortion, robbery and kidnapping. Many are involved in the heroin trade, which is booming as opioid addiction drives up American demand. In a disturbing trend, desperate and frightened communities increasingly seek at least the illusion of security by lynching suspected criminals. Mr. Ungar said these expressions of vigilantism represent a disempowerment of the state, paralysis amid disaster. President Enrique Peña Nieto presenting the fifth annual government report of Mexican to members of parliament in September. Mario Guzman, European press photo agency. Mexicans seem keenly aware that their government is growing less responsive just as streets are becoming more dangerous. Polls show growing dissatisfaction, particularly over corruption. We have this political class that totally forgets why they are there, said Armando Torres, a community activist in Guadalupe, a working-class city in the northeast. Each election, he said, brings a new official with a new 3-year plan. Most, he added, leave office conspicuously wealthier. When officials do act, they address superficial issues, adding more patrols or changing police strategy without confronting what he called the country's social decomposition. Mr. Valde, the former head of the intelligence service, described facing a similar struggle in top levels of government. We wanted to improve the institutions, the judges, the jails, the police, he said. We spent years trying to convince the political class, but he found those institutions, dominated by parties rather than technocrats and subject to the whims of officials who are required by law to cycle out every term, unresponsive, just as Mr. Torres had. What's happening in Guadalupe is what's happening in all of Mexico, Mr. Torres said. There was a political demand for change, but nothing really changed for us. The Interpreter is a column by Max Fisher and Amanda Taub exploring the ideas and context behind major world events. Follow them on Twitter at Max Fisher and at Amanda Taub. A version of this article appears in print on October 29, 2017, on page A16 of the New York edition with the headline "Mexico's record violence is a crisis 20 years in the making."